The following program is a presentation of BaseNet Internet Television.
Hello, ViewPoint listeners. This is BaseNet Internet Television national political correspondent Tony Mazzucco coming to you with episode 14 of ViewPoint. And I'm joined this evening here with our producer and director of programming for BaseNet, Ed Jupin. Ed, how are you?
Good evening, sir. And you almost called me Ted. Oh, man, there would have been hell to pay if you would have called me Ted.
Oh, boy.
But
for most people, the difference between Ted and Ed is just a T. But for those of us who knew the infamous Ted Kostobopoulos, that's about as big of an insult as you can get. Before we get into today's show, just a couple of quick reminders. One, as always, you can view us on BaseNetTV.com. We are on every single social media applet that is out there. You can find us. You can always email us at ViewPoint@BaseNetTV.com. And more importantly, from the BaseNetTV.com homepage, you can donate, or you can click on ads. Either way, it helps us going. We are still running our Jimmy Fund promotion through the first week of June, where 20% of what you donate will go to the Jimmy Fund, because a little in abundance is a lot. And we will announce those totals at the... Ed, is it the After Dark coverage that we do with the school?
It's about Boston.
About Boston.
Yep, Jill Henley will be there for her second year. Holly Hurley did it 2 years prior to that. So it's about Boston this year.
That sounds good. We're looking forward to that. And just to let our listeners know, the infamous Ted Kostobopoulos was a gentleman who used to work with Ed and I, who had a problem punching in and out for his required breaks. When yell at him, this gentleman worked for me, and I would say, Ted, did you punch out for a break? He would go, yeah, of course. Ted, are you sure you punched out for a break? Yeah, no problem. Ted, don't friggin' lie to me. You're sure you punched out for a break? Okay, Mr. Mazzucco, I punched out for a break. Yeah, I get it already. I punched out, trust me. And 2 minutes later,
Ted didn't punch out for a break.
Punch out. I mean, we nearly fired this employee for not remembering to punch in and out on time. Oh, the days of Ted Kostobopoulos. But anyway, we're not here to talk about Ted Kostobopoulos. We are here to talk about news, politics, media, and how they interrelate. And we've got two big issues that we're going to look at today. And we're really going to try to break them down, which is what we like to do here at ViewPoint, and really have an intelligent discussion of them. First and foremost, the president has come out openly in support of gay marriage. Now, for those of you who are expecting a show where we talk about the merits of gay marriage and of same-sex marriage and go through all the states and where the bills are and where the processes are, you're going to have to sign off, because you're not going to get that from us. We're interested in the politics of it, the meaning of it, what's behind it. The mainstream media can throw their crap up there, but we want to look at the politics. That's what ViewPoint is about, of this decision. Now, the first thing we're going to look at, and just to preface, I'm sure everyone knows, a little over a week ago, the President of the United States came out and said he openly supported the concept of same-sex marriage, or same-sex marriage. And there's been some discussion as to whether or not Joe Biden, made a slip-up and the president sort of had to do some damage control and this was his choice to do it. I think it's more likely that they sort of got the idea out there in the media with Joe Biden, and then the president sort of was able to come out and say something. If Biden hadn't had his planned slip-up, as we'll call it, I don't think that the president really could have come out and said he supported gay marriage without people being like, wait a minute, where the heck did this come from? So it sort of came out there in the media, and the president decided he wanted to go for it. Now, let's talk about why the president decided to support gay marriage. Now, some of you are going to say, first of all, if you're offended as to the use of the term gay marriage versus same-sex marriage, I apologize. It's just easier to use one term over the other. I'll probably switch back in between the two of them. I hope I haven't offended any of you. Anyway, far be it for me to really generally care about offending people, but anyway. So we're going to call it a political decision because, like we said, look, the president is a political guy. Every president is. I'm not calling him an evil, warmongering bastard or anything like that by making a political decision, but presidents make political decisions. So that being said, it was a political decision. You've got to understand where the president was up till this decision, and to an extent certain immediately after it, and even now. The right is fairly well unified against Obama. His own party was starting to show quite a few problems. His base, in the core of this, was twofold. One was his base was just not energized the way it was in 2008. Now, we could go into why that might be. Some people say he hasn't been progressive enough and he hasn't accomplished enough. Some people say he's backed off. Some people are upset on the left that they just don't think anything's been done. those reasons are up for debate. We're not going to debate them today, but the bottom line is it is statistically proven his base was just not as energized and as rah-rah as they were for him in the past. He wasn't drawing those big crowds. I believe his official campaign announcement drew a very small crowd. I forget if it was at UNC Chapel Hill or somewhere nearby where he only filled half or two-thirds of the stadium. And that's sort of a sad crowd for a sad night of attendance.
Yeah, there were, tens of thousands of empty seats in the background, so they had to reset the shot and everything so that you didn't see all of those empty seats. And of course, mainstream media was all over that, saying, "Boy, this is a far cry from his
couple years,
from like his acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention when they had those, the Greek pillars and everything that they had this big Hollywood show in front of. Far cry from that."
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, he has not been drawing big crowds at some of his other events. Now, that all may appear anecdotal. However, the truth of the matter is his fundraising up until this announcement had been rather anemic. Now, a year or so prior to this point in the election process, Republicans were terrified because they looked at the amount of money he raised in 2008 and they project that off with inflation and, you get the boost because you're already in office and all that jazz. And they were expecting him to raise over $1 billion. And he probably still will. I mean, $1 billion presidential campaign. Good God, think of the lives that could change. But anyway, so his fundraising had been rather anemic and he was failing to keep pace with, he was beating, I believe, Romney in fundraising, but him and the DNC could not beat the combined will of Romney and the RNC. And more importantly, the right-leaning PACs out there, those political action committees that can raise unlimited amounts of money, those on the right were far, far dwarfing those on the left. So they were very, very worried. So the president was in a precarious position where he's an individual who relies on his base. I mean, anyone does to an extent, but in a close election, he really, really needs his base to come out in full force. Because remember, that base, you're counting on 90% of those hardcore left or right, whatever they happen to be, to vote for you, and they lose that energy, and they're going to stay home. Some people say that impacted John McCain because a significant portion, I mean not majority, but a large enough portion to make a difference of the Republican base is evangelicals who just didn't really care to come out for him. And, that obviously had an impact. Remember, Barack Obama only won with about 54 or 55% of the vote. This wasn't some resounding, 88% of the vote. This wasn't Ronald Reagan in 1984. His base was not energized. So the president's probably making a very intelligent political decision, said, look, the worst case scenario, people on the right already don't like me. They already hate me. They're already not going to vote for me. So just pissing them off and riling them up, it's one more thing. And here's where it's smart. And again, I'm going to compliment the president. It's going to get the right riled up on a social issue when really he's going to want to distract them from economic issues. And that's why it's very smart when you think about it. To be honest with you, the response from the right has been rather muted, and I think that's an intelligent decision for that very reason. If they're smart, people on the right will say, you know what, we're going to use this. The voters are going to know about it, but we're not going to take the bait. And
don't fall for a trap.
Exactly. And if they had gone hard out now, Mitt Romney made his statement, I support traditional marriage, blah, blah, blah. They're playing their line, but they're not trying to make it a central issue because they know that the Obama administration wants to make this campaign about social issues and probably foreign policy. And if the Republicans are smart, they're going to not want to go there, and they're going to make it about the economy. So, I mean, both sides are being pretty intelligent. But anyway, the reaction on the left has been interesting. Right away, I think it was in 90 minutes, he raised $1 million. Again, Obama figured that this would probably rile up his base in his favor, which it seems to have. He had a huge fundraiser hosted by George Clooney, raised something like $20 or $25 million. I don't blame the president for this, but I mean, Hollywood, don't you have better things to do with your money? You could probably cure a kind of cancer or something for $25 million, but whatever. Romney's doing the same thing on the other side. Today's a very non-judgmental episode until we get to the full disclosure editorial. That being said, he figured it would really get up the far left up in arms to support him, the progressive movement, the LGBT community. He figured it would probably get them up in arms to have that same enthusiasm. And when you think about it, it's a very smart move for the reasons I just explained. Especially you take the LGBT community, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and sometimes they add other letters to it. By and large, they're more likely to vote for the president. However, the difference between that base being engaged and not engaged can make the difference in an election, especially in the cities where they tend to be more bigger percentage of the voter voting population where Obama needs to win the cities. That being said, that's pretty much been the reaction on the left. We're going to talk about whether the reaction on the left hasn't been so good in a minute. But, and we briefly touched on it earlier, the fallout on the right, again, the right has been somewhat muted on this. Mitt Romney gave his commencement speech at Liberty University, which was Jerry Falwell's school, and, talked about traditional marriage. Other people, I believe it was Rand Paul, came out, which I was a little surprised, and said something to the effect of, the president's remarks couldn't have been gayer. Kind of a funny statement, way to phrase it. But they've taken their shots, but they haven't taken the bait. And you'd almost think that of all the social issues that the right tends to get riled up about, and this is definitely one of them, that they would have really, really, really been up in arms. But I think they're smart. For once, I'll give the RNC credit for realizing that they were being baited by the Democrats and not really taking the bait. Because I can't count how many times in the last 10 or more years that Republicans get baited by Democrats and they just take the bait and they swallow it hook, line, and sinker.
Now, to dissect this a little deeper real quickly, since we went through the whole primary process and dissecting every step along the way, how do you think that this whole same-sex marriage issue could ultimately affect the general election? As in, did this announcement lose the South for Obama? Did it lose the Bible Belt for Obama?
Well, there's two ways, and that actually leads right to my next little segment here. Obama was likely to lose the South no matter what. Obama was likely to lose the Bible Belt no matter what. You are going to see some voters in each be more willing to come out against the president than they were for him, than they were to just not come out, because it is a big issue to people. I mean, North Carolina just voted
with the constitutional amendment.
Right. And even California had passed the constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage, and then the Supreme Court overturned it. I don't know how the state Supreme Court overturns constitutional amendments, but whatever. That's California for you. That's why they're billions in debt. They can't figure their stuff out. So I think it is going to have some unifying impact on the Bible Belt and on some of the more conservative Southerners who may not have been thrilled about Mitt Romney. Not that I don't think they don't like Mitt Romney, but remember, he did lose in some of the more conservative states to the more conservative primary candidates who have now all gone away, including bastards with diabetes. Now, that's a good thing for the Republicans. That's probably the unintended consequence, or I guess I would say at best the sort of cost of doing business is that, you're going to get some more people who will be a little bit more enthused for Romney because they don't like Obama's decision on gay marriage. But here's where it's starting to hurt the president and could really hurt him, is among urban individuals, and in particular urban youth, which is code word in the mainstream media for black folk. Having grown up in a minority-majority community, I'm okay, I guess, with using the term black, but African Americans throughout the country, in an interesting take on American politics, generally are much more socially conservative than even a lot of Republicans and a lot of other Democrats, even though African Americans overwhelmingly vote for Democrats. It's interesting enough. I don't think this will be as much of a galvanizing issue. African Americans used to vote Republican after the time of Lincoln. And when FDR came around, I believe the phrase that a lot of people used or that was popular was, it was time to turn the picture of Lincoln on the mantle around. And perhaps now it's time to turn that picture of Lincoln back around, for the simple fact that many, many African Americans are very socially conservative, and they do not like the idea of gay marriage. I was reading articles that urban radio stations in New York City were getting quite a lot of callers where they were very adamant that they did not like Obama and they did not like this gay marriage decision. All of a sudden, he could see himself getting hurt. And I think it would be mostly people staying home as opposed to going out for Mitt Romney, but in communities that he was winning 90% plus of the vote. That's where that makes a big impact. Now, Obama had to make a political calculation. In the end, it may mean nothing. The economy could collapse, war could break out, all these different things could happen in between them that would make this a non-issue. And maybe in the history, we'll just look at it as a quick cash bump for the Obama campaign. I think that he risks losing what is an important base of his. Now, does that mean that an area that last election voted 97% for Barack Obama going to all of a sudden vote for Mitt Romney? Not at all. But even if 5, 6, 7% of those people stay home, that's a huge chunk because it's all coming right out of his vote. And that's where it's really fascinating to see this backlash. Now, something that we haven't necessarily seen yet, but is equally interesting, Many Hispanic families are very Catholic and as such also socially conservative, more so than their political counterparts in the Democratic Party. That's evident in California's decision with, I believe, was it Prop 9 in California? They have so many props.
I believe so, yeah.
Where people were surprised that very liberal California passed a constitutional amendment. And there was some, very good canvassing and all that a lot of groups did. I mean, they really put the power to it. And again, California has their weird ballot system anyway. A lot of those were Hispanics who otherwise are voting straight party lines with the Democrats, but are very socially conservative. This could end up hurting the president with the socially conservative Hispanics.
Well, and getting back to the African Americans too, it's the same thing. If you look at just from my life experience, I don't want to stereotype anybody or say they all are, but a lot of African American religious beliefs are Southern Baptists and so on and so forth. They're just not for gay marriage.
Absolutely, and
they're the, and I don't mean it in a negative way, the Bible thumpers. They're not for gay marriage.
Yeah, absolutely, and they're people who otherwise, by and large, are voting strict Democrats. So now they're torn. There are even some black pastors in D.C. and in Maryland who have come out and said they're just going to oppose the pastor on this. They're going to oppose.
Well, it doesn't look like the convention may not be held in the North or South Carolina now. It was scheduled to be held there.
Yeah, they'd be, I don't know if they want to, sort of open up that hornet's nest. So it's very interesting. This may have a short-term benefit for the president. It may rile up his base, but he's really playing to his far-left base to try to drone up that enthusiasm. It's a risk. It might pay off if other issues develop down the road. Financially already, it certainly paid off. It's interesting that it may not in the long run, but also internationally, this is somewhat taboo. Now, some countries have come out and said, he's setting a world standard. This is great, blah, blah, blah. But a lot of African countries, Asian countries, and some South American countries, especially the Middle East, they tend to be a lot more conservative. And this is a very taboo issue for them. It's a divisive issue in America. It's a controversial issue in America. It's not a taboo issue in America. It's very taboo in a lot of countries around the world. And I'm sure that they're sort of reacting quietly and sort of saying, we don't know if this is what we bargained for here. I'm sure it did take some courage on the part of the president to come forward with it. I also think that, I guess to wrap it all up with this one particular issue with the president, he made a political calculation. We still haven't seen too much of the fallout. We've seen the initial fallout. Ultimately, Election Day is going to determine what the fallout is from this. It could continue to grow absent another galvanizing issue that is going to, could potentially hurt the president maybe more than he's going to, maybe it's more than it's going to benefit him. Now, if this comes up in one of the debates, the president is going to have to come out openly in a debate and say that he supports it. Otherwise, people are going to call him a flip-flopper and all that. Mitt Romney's going to come out and say he's probably more he's probably opposed to it. Now, somebody might point out that gay marriage became legal first in Massachusetts. Romney's counter will be that was a Supreme Court decision. They'll say that Romney ordered town clerks to issue the marriage licenses or be fired. And I remember at the time this happened in Massachusetts, some people in the there wasn't the Tea Party movement, sorry, the Article 8 Alliance in Massachusetts, the Mass Alliance for Families, said that, the governor could order town clerks to do the exact opposite and not to issue these licenses. And although we could say maybe he should have stood up and been more courageous, I think he did realize that the Supreme Court in Massachusetts made a decision, and ultimately you do sort of have to go with those short of changing the law as it's written. I think Mitt Romney will come back and say, Mr. President, the Supreme Court in Massachusetts, the state Supreme Court, said this was law. I went along with it. I'm not a dictator. I'm not a unitary actor. What the Supreme Court says, we do have to go with. So I think that's a fairly good comeback for Romney if it comes up in the debates. Although similar to healthcare, I think this might be one of those things where Barack Obama hopes it doesn't come up in a debate. But if it does, it could re-galvanize a lot of those more socially conservative African Americans and Hispanics against the president to say, you know what, here he is in this debate. He's saying he supports gay marriage, and this other guy here doesn't. I just don't want to vote for Barack Obama. Again, I think it's more of a they don't want to vote for him than they're going to run to Romney. But, a win is a win in politics, whether it's by winning, more people voting for you or less people voting for the other guy. Either way, you come out on top, you're the winner.
And my ending thought on the subject is it's going to hurt the president more than it's going to help him.
I think so. I think it may have been a miscalculation on his part. He might get a lot of young people up in arms about him, but let's face it, young people don't vote. He won young people handily last election, but they still don't come out in droves. And the one last thing we got to throw out there, old people, and I hate to characterize old people as such, but you know what I mean, ladies and gentlemen, Old people, elderly voters tend to be more socially conservative, even though in Florida especially they tend to vote strict Democrats. They're more likely to not like the whole gay marriage thing. So this could really come to hurt the president. But there's so many other things that could go on between now and then that we'll have to see whether or not this is a galvanizing issue. I will say one final thought. When the president, prior to the Republicans taking control, would have been a better time to do this. You know, maybe when he argued for the repealing of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, that would have been a better time to go ahead and say, hey, you know what, let's go one step forward and do this. Because then the anger would have kind of subsided by Election Day. Whereas here, you know, less than 6 months out, people are still going to remember this, and it's going to hurt people whose votes he really needs and really relied on last time. But we're going to move on to the crisis in Greece and the crisis in Europe, which one way or another should resolve itself by the end of June. And I really want to talk with everyone about what this means, because the mainstream media kind of talks about it, and then they don't really explain what it means, and then everyone's left asking questions, and I think people don't pay attention seriously enough. So we're going to really delve into the political system in Europe for a bit and what this means, and then at the very end I'm going to bring it back and talk about what the impact on us is. So the issue is, will Greece exit the euro? Now, what the heck does that mean? What does exiting the euro mean? Is it like leaving the bathroom? Well, kinda. You know, is it like you get off the plane at the airport and you get in this lane to exit the airport? Sorta. Now, the euro, as we all know, is a European common currency. It's a 17 or 19 nation bloc that shares one currency.
Bring back the drachma.
Bring back the drachma. Now, a Greek exit from the euro would effectively happen, and I'm going to get this a little wrong because this gets complicated, but essentially Greece has a lot of debt, an enormous amount of debt, in an enormous public sector, enormous government spending, and they've gone through some harsh austerity measures. But unfortunately, this is one of those countries where people will work, 25, 30 hours a week at a government job for 20 years and then retire with a full pay pension. And, it's the Mediterranean. They're going to live another 40 years on this pension. That's nice, but it's just not sustainable. Very, very, very young retirement ages, generous state benefits. Farmers in all of the small villages who probably couldn't make enough to get by being farmers get significant stipends from the government just to hang out and be farmers. And a lot of this, like in the United States, although we're not nearly as bad as Greece, has been financed through debt, through borrowing. In Europe, there are the countries that produce money, that export a lot, Germany, some of the other Northern European countries. And then there are the southern periphery countries, Greece primarily, also Italy, which we're going to talk about, in Spain and Portugal, which also collectively are known as pigs. Portugal, Ireland used to be one of them, Italy and Greece and Spain. Greece has a massive, massive amount of debt. And if there comes a point, or the way the situation is now, let me backtrack it, is that they're getting loans from Europe, from the ECB, the European Common Bank, I believe, and the European Union, to basically pay their other loans that they have borrowed through bond markets and all that, to pay for their social services. Now, we had elections recently in Greece, and the two main parties that have pretty much one or the other been in power for the last 40 years lost power, and they don't have a government formed. What that means is, in a parliamentary system, the party with the most votes, or hopefully a party with a majority, becomes the party of government. Think of them as, the Republicans in Congress. They win, they then get to form the government. They pick all the different ministers and all that. That's the way a parliamentary system works. However,
just like in Great Britain.
Exactly, same exact system. However, if nobody wins a majority, you have to form coalitions. Now, if the party with the most amount of votes needs to form a coalition, they have a couple days, then they can ask another party to form a coalition, and it goes down and down. Well, the problem is it doesn't look like a government has been or will be formed because the vote was split too many ways. One of the biggest getters was the party with over 18 or 19% that is very, very far left, even for Europe. They are an anti-bailout, anti-EU austerity party, and they garnered a significant amount of the vote. There was one far-right party that got either 7 or 9% of the vote. That is, they're called fascists, neo-Nazis. They believe on putting landmines in the borders to prevent immigrants from coming. They are also violently anti-EU bailout, anti-austerity, because the conditions of the bailout in Greece have been harsh austerity measures. In reality, they're not that harsh. I mean, they are when you think of the amount of money and benefits people are losing, but they shouldn't have been living off them anyway to begin with. But I don't want to get too much into the politics of Greece's horrible mistakes. Now, essentially what would happen is Greece would default on its debt. That means that they essentially just stop paying their debt. Now, the European Union at that point would be forced to possibly kick Greece out of the EU. Because they have a common currency, a Greek default, not paying their debt,
brings down everybody.
Down everybody, and it would affect the overall credit ratings of the European Union, and the value of the euro would plummet. That's going to happen anyway. That's the best way to explain it. And again, I know I'm getting it a little wrong there.
Now, how does the United States fit into that picture? Are we in debt to them, or are they in debt to us, or neither of the above?
Explain exactly why it's critically important to us. We do have a certain degree of exposure to European banks, several $100 billion worth, which could become a problem, because what a Greek default means, I don't know why everyone likes to use the word default. I mean, you default on your mortgage payment. Nobody says you defaulted on your credit card payment. Basically, they've borrowed money and they're not paying it. So somebody's getting screwed. If you're a bank, let's say a United States bank, an American bank, and you lent $4 million to the city of Saloniki, Greece, for a roadway project, and they just stopped making the payment on it. Well, that's what we call exposure. All of a sudden, you could be screwed. Now, how Greece would get around this is they would go back to their own currency, whether a result of Europe kicking them out and saying, get the hell out of here, we don't want you bringing the rest of us down, or they just decide, we can't pay our people, we don't have any of these euros coming in. They would dump the euro and reinstate the drachma, which was the Greek currency prior to joining the EU, and essentially print their way out of this mess. Now, we know that doesn't work because it causes inflation and hyperinflation, and every case where it's happened, that will happen in Greece. The argument is that what that would allow them to do is there would be a couple years of very, very harsh times. We're talking 50, 60% unemployment, hyperinflation, I mean, awful years, but that the economy would start to recover because the Greek currency would get devalued so much that investment would actually flow to Greece because everything would be dirt cheap. Now, in a sense, you're selling your country's assets is one way to look at it, because all of a sudden property market crashes, investments crash, and people run in, they say, hey, you know what? We wanted to buy this cruise line that's a Greek company. It was $800 million US last week. Well, now it's only $200 million. We're going to buy it because in 7 or 8 years, this is going to be over and it's going to be a huge investment. So there's issues with the foreigners coming in and all that, but that's effectively what would happen. Their currency, and they would be printing their way out of this mess, which would lead to, again, hyperinflation, as we said, some very, very tough years. But this did happen recently in Argentina in 2001. They defaulted on their debt, and they've somewhat recovered. Slightly different situation. The hope is that Greece would do the same. Now, why is this an issue for the rest of Europe, which we're going to get to understand why this is important for us in the U.S.? If Greece were to default on its debt, which looks like it's going to happen, and it looks like it's going to get kicked out of the European Union, or at least the euro, if not the EU altogether, borrowing costs, which is the interest rate on debt, which governments fund themselves through debt primarily, would skyrocket for other European countries. Now, Italy, Spain, and Portugal are considered somewhat next in line. Their economies are in similar situations. High levels of debt. A lot of their banks have made loans they can't cover, and they have huge public sectors and public sector expenditures. Their borrowing costs, which they've already started to go in Italy. Italy is just about to enter recession. I think they're not ready to declare it yet, but it looked like their second quarter growth was negative. I forget if it's 2 or 3 consecutive quarters they consider a recession. There's 11 other European countries that are technically in recession, Greece being one of them. So I think the economy's worse than we're making it out to be. But anyway, you would see Portugal, Italy, and Spain, their borrowing costs rise significantly. So all of a sudden, they were paying, let's say, 6% interest to borrow money to fund fundamental government services and all that, would jump to 8, 10, 12, 14%. Well, at that higher level, it becomes too expensive to borrow the money, and you either default or you start seeing serious cuts in the public sector. And I don't mean trimming some pensions. I mean economic collapse. The government really would need to make that revenue up somewhere. They would likely dramatically raise taxes, which does 2 things. 1, it hampers economic growth, and 2, it takes money out of the country. Now, there's already been what we would call a run on Greek banks. What that means is that people are starting to take their money out of Greek banks and send it somewhere else. In the event that there was a Greek collapse or exit from the euro, those bank accounts would probably, because they're in Greece, be converted to drachma, which would effectively be worthless. You could see millions and millions of dollars of wealth wiped out overnight. That's going to possibly also cause the collapse as well, as Greek banks run out of money, as everyone's pulling every last dime out of them. As you know, a bank can't live without its deposits, and it would eventually just fold. And that's probably going to cause a problem too. But anyway,
So in a case like that, a conversion case like that, money is just potentially literally does disappear into thin air. If I'm a millionaire and we're going to change our currency format, I could lose everything.
absolutely, that's exactly how it could happen. You could have 50,000 euros in the bank, and what would happen is they would pick a peg level and they would say, well, your 50,000 euros are now 50,000 drachma. And unfortunately, the way the currency markets work, all of a sudden it would change so that 1 euro would be worth 1,000 drachma. So whereas one day that 50,000 bucks you had in the bank could buy you a car or whatever, it all of a sudden now might be able to buy you an oil change.
Yep.
And it rarely happens in Western countries. It's more of a third world concept. But sadly, it is happening in Greece, and that's how that money would get wiped out. Now, if that happens in Greece and the borrowing skyrockets in Portugal, Spain, and Italy, you're talking about the potential for this happening there too. Now, Europe might act to help solidify their economies, but they're in a bad shape as it is. Listen, the United States has the largest debt in the world. However, we do have the largest economy in the world. Second is Japan, with the second highest debt in the world. Also has the second biggest economy in the world. Might be third. They tend to follow. Next is Italy. So Italy has a much, much higher debt relative to its size. Again, the United States, about 330 million people. Japan, about 130 million people. Italy, 57 million people. So significantly smaller, significantly high debt. Now, Greece only has about 10 or 11 million people, which is funny when you think about it, that something that effectively has less the population than the smaller population than, the greater New York metro area is possibly going to crash the whole world economy. If that happens and Greece gets kicked out of the EU, first of all, the value of the euro will drop. It will cause all sorts of problems. It's going to put so much pressure on Spain, Portugal, and Italy that they may eventually fall next. Now, what does this mean for the United States? Well, it means a couple of things as we get into finally why this is so important. So
I already see it as that if this happens, we're screwed in the United States as well.
We absolutely are, and for several reasons. There's many different ways that this impacts us that people don't realize. One is bank exposure, and that is if you have a bank or if you have an investment, if you have a 401k or whatever it is that's invested in Europe, all of a sudden that could see a huge loss or a tremendous value. I mean, think of it this way: at a very basic level, the Bank of Boston. I don't think there's a Bank of Boston anymore. Citizens Bank, which is actually a foreign company, anyway, loaned money to Greece, and all of a sudden they're not getting it back. That's not going to help those banks. As banks fail, investments fail, 401ks fail, the stock market fails, our ability to export to this country gets screwed, and that has a serious impact. Now, other way that it has an impact on us is we are a big trading partner with Europe. We sell what little we sell in this country, a lot of high value goods to Europe. That is to say, what few washing machines, etc., that we sell, we're not selling them to Zimbabwe. We're not selling them to Guyana. We're not selling them really to the Philippines. All of our higher price items and our higher ticket items go to Europe. That's who we sell them to. So all of a sudden, these buyers are going to feel a real big credit crunch, and we're not going to be able to sell a lot of our high ticket items. It's going to have a very, very big impact on us, on assets we have over there, on bank exposures, and it could drive our borrowing costs for the government, which are still currently very low. It could drive them up significantly because lenders out there might say, hey, nobody ever thought a Western European nation, Greece is Southeastern Europe, but consider the West, would default on its payment. And God forbid if it happens, Portugal, which has often been called many bad words of Europe, we'll just call them, what's the word I want to use, redheaded stepchild of Europe, or of Western Europe, you might be able to get okay with. But if Spain or Italy default, forget about it. Confidence is going to get shot through the foot. Now, this might be a good long-term effect, but short-term, it's going to cause a lot of problems. The United Kingdom, interestingly enough...
I was just going to... You read my mind. I was going to say, how does the UK fit into this since they didn't join up with the EU?
They're actually doing well for two reasons. One, as the socialist president, Holland, whatever his name is, in France has taken over, you've seen a huge jump in the property market in London as wealthy Europeans from France and Greece are now looking to rent property in London. And they're going to look to move to the UK and move all of their money to Britain as well. London still being the financial center of Europe and still not having as high a corporate tax rate and still not being as close to the brink as Greece or any of those other countries, but also not being as involved in the common currency. England's going to take a hit too, but they're not as involved as France and Germany are. So the UK is, in a sense, has a chance to do well. Now, the only positive benefit for the United States could be as the euro declines, the US dollar starts to become sort of that global currency again that it once was, that people thought the euro might take it over with now. I think talks of the euro overtaking the dollar are dead, if not.
Now the euro's finished.
Possibly our lifetime. I mean, I think the currency will survive just for what some people had said is that, they may shed a couple of these countries like Greece and have a more integrated European Union where it's much more closely integrated than it currently is, but of countries that can sustain it. Because remember, Germany is what they call the paymaster of Europe. And the reason is that Germany has the strongest economy and the most government revenues, tax revenues, as you will, and is the biggest exporter in Europe. And Germany doesn't have as much of a social welfare state as even France does, and especially nothing near what its southern European friends who like to just kind of hang out and sit on the beach. And being Mediterranean myself, I can understand that. But so Germany is likely to want to impose much tighter fiscal controls. Now, both Germany and France have said they want Greece to stay in the euro. The Greek people have by and large said they want to stay in the euro. But Greece, or I should say Germany and France, may just be saying that to keep the markets calm. You know how markets get jittery and investors get jittery and all that? They might just be saying it. But a lot of banks have been preparing, and other organizations, for the last 2 years for a possible Greek exit from the euro. Now, I want to talk about backing up from where the horrific impact it's likely to have on the United States as a very large trading partner sees a significant diminishing ability in their purchasing power, as we see American assets and bank loans and exposure over to here significantly threatened and could cause all sorts of problems. And again, do we want banks in America to start failing? You know how that goes. They're saying that Greece's default could be like the Lehman Brothers collapse of 2008, which was really the beginning of the end for the or the beginning of the beginning for these economic problems that we've been facing these last several years, the Obama years. Greece default, the way it would happen, and several articles have said this, is it wouldn't actually be such a big announcement because they don't want markets and investors to go crazy. They would effectively just issue a press statement or something else saying they have officially defaulted. They would literally seal their borders, and figuratively they would block all outgoing transfers from banks and from financial institutions and all that, and probably issue a conversion to the currency. And they might literally actually take stamps and start stamping euros with a drachma value. And it would only take them, they've said, about 3 to 5 months to actually have an entire new currency flowing through. The government would probably begin collecting the euros and exchanging them from drachma. And they might do it at a fair exchange rate, 1-for-1, but then the drachma is going to plummet. So again, one way to look at what that means, even if you didn't effectively lose all of your life savings, you had 50,000 euros in the bank and you were given 50,000 drachma.
On the surface, it almost sounds like a good thing. It's almost like, well, you'd be starting off with a clean slate. It's almost like a business or a person who declares bankruptcy and you're just starting from scratch.
Some people are saying, they're saying that the problem is that if the rest of the world's economy was growing and the European Union was doing fine and Greece did this, it would really be isolated to Greece. The biggest concern is that it's not isolated to Greece and it's going to spread and cause other problems. If this could happen in Greece and not have any other impact anywhere else in Europe or the world, it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. Now, the Greeks are in for a couple of hard years. You're talking about hyperinflation. You're talking about unemployment running way up, people leaving the country, capital leaving the country, government-owned industries getting sold off for pennies on the dollar. So, but history has shown that countries that go through this do come out stronger, much like a bankruptcy. A lot of times corporations, and I'll use a local Boston corporation of national amusements that which owns Viacom and Paramount Pictures and MTV and all that. They had to go through a restructuring recently where to make some debt payments, they had to sell off a lot of their theater locations, which they had those markets for 30, 40, 50 years. They did it to do it, and now they're back on their feet, and it was Viacom that had tanked. It wasn't the theater chain, and they're actually looking into buying back some of those locations. So it was a tough decision, but it kept them afloat, and they kept going. But we can't look at what's happening in Greece as a good thing necessarily because of the impact it could have on everything else. It may be a good thing in the sense that Greece just may not have another option. To continue getting loans from the European Union they're going to have to continue these harsh austerity measures, which, again, they're not necessarily harsh when you look at them from the outside, but no matter what, if you're a pensioner, you know, a retired person, somebody on Social Security, as we would say here in the United States, and you've been getting an income of $40,000 a year, and all of a sudden it gets cut to $18,000 a year, that's very difficult to live off of. Now, yeah, you can make the argument, and it's absolutely correct, that it never should have been that high to begin with, but no matter what, you're talking about dramatic lifestyle changes and dramatic cuts in an individual's lifestyle and their what they can afford that has a huge, huge impact. Greece could literally screw the rest of the Western world with this, but they may not have another option. As I was saying, these austerity measures are deeply, deeply unpopular, and the European Union is not likely to continue with these loans, and they've said they won't if Greece doesn't continue with these deep austerity measures. Now, things could always change. The United States has lent a lot of money to European banks in the last few months, very quietly, because it's come from the Federal Reserve, who literally print up the money and send it over and hope nobody notices. And apparently the mainstream media doesn't pick up on it, so it's pretty much like nobody does notice. Greece may have no other option. They may be in for a tough couple of years, but it may work out better in the long run. The end result of this segment, what I want everyone to take away is to pay close attention to what's going on, because it's going to have a bigger impact on us than we think it's going to have. There's going to be a push in the media to underreport and undervalue these stories, because they are going to get screamed at by everyone and their mother to do that, because you don't want to create a panic, which is true. But again, investors who may not know that much about the markets but might nonetheless be multimillionaires see a news story talking about how Greece is collapsing, it's awful, and this, that, the other thing. They're going to start calling up their brokers and say, hey, get me out of there. I don't want anything with exposure to this. And it's going to, cause a tumble effect and all that other stuff. So really pay close attention to this, because it could have a huge impact on us here, our economy. And because this is about politics, a Greek default could cause severe economic turbulence, which could really hamper the president's reelection ability. That's enough on the European crisis. We have one more news story for you today. There was an article in the Ottawa Sun written by a bright Canadian about Canada's impact on NATO and Canada's relationship with NATO. And effectively, NATO's come up with a term called something like smart defense or smart appropriations or whatever. Do more with less is what it is. And Canada's complaint is that it was twofold, that NATO's stretched thin. All of its countries, with the exception somewhat of Canada, are broke. They're losing money. They're cutting defense expenses. The UK has gotten rid of an aircraft battle carrier group. The US is cutting military research and development. But also that the U.S. is moving forces towards the Pacific and restructuring the Pacific. And the article's tone was somewhat that Europe should really realize, or NATO, I shouldn't say Europe, NATO should realize that maybe they're not really there to just defend Europe anymore, and that France's western shores or western beaches are no longer what NATO's there to defend and to protect, and that it's really Canada and the United States' western shores that they should be looking at. And that's obviously a reference to a growing and assertive China, a likelihood that there will be conflict with China in the next 10 or 12 years. And as the Arctic opens up, which is a big concern for Canada, and those sea lanes begin to open up, NATO needs to look more towards what's going on in North America than it once did in Europe. And, I think there was a little gloating that Canada has handled the recession a little bit better than other countries. They've moved a little bit more directly to actually make some significant impacts and changes, whereas the United States has kind of moved on and whatnot, or I should say bungled our stimulus and all that. And the Europeans are just sort of running around, and in day one it's austerity, day two it's socialism, and they can't seem to figure out what they want. So it was a very interesting article, and I think it brings home a truth that the world focus is going to need to shift to Asia and away from Europe, and maybe this European financial crisis is just that. Now, I want to draw an interesting parallel, and this is just my own little conspiracy theory here. In the last couple of years, there have been some large-scale military activities in the United States, in Florida and in California and in a couple other places. And a lot of federal agencies have been stockpiling food and bullets and all that. And conspiracy theorists tend to say, oh, they're planning for massive social unrest and having to occupy our own cities and this, that, and the other thing. And while that's certainly a possibility, I mean, on the one hand, let's face it, if they think that's going to happen, wouldn't you expect them to plan for it? I mean, I know it sounds awful, but I would hope somebody would say...
It makes sense, sure.
But I think, and this is just my long-term planning mind going here, and we got to realize something. The military planners at the Pentagon, by and large, are very intelligent people, looking long-term, looking big picture. I think they're planning for a war with China. Because in the next 10 to 15 years, or possibly Russia, who do you think we might go to war with that has very many big modern metropolises that we may need to invade and take over? And the answer is China. Not North Korea, because they don't have anything like that. It's not Iran. I mean, again, Iran has its cities are modern and whatnot, but China, I mean, you're talking about cities like Shanghai or even Hong Kong or Beijing or whatever that are very big, very modern metropolises. I almost think that's what they're going for. In the stockpiling of weapons and food and all that domestically, a war with China would likely cost us more than just some troops overseas. They would retaliate, possibly with a nuclear strike. I don't think they'd go that option, only because even if they could launch all their missiles and hit all our major cities, which is not that likely, we still have a huge submarine fleet with all sorts of nuclear weapons on them. And I think that would kind of lead them to realize that
it's a no-win situation.
And it's almost more than a no-win situation because we've got so many big cities, whereas even if you take out all the main ones, we've got our secondary cities. Yes, it would set the U.S. back a couple generations, etc., but the missiles are going to come flying back either from the continent in the bombers or from the subs, and that China would eventually lose. Not to mention, I mean, in nearly 70 years, the United States is the only country that's actually used a nuclear weapon on someone else. But they might respond by doing something that could cripple the electrical grid, which they could possibly cause, tens of millions of deaths. And although that would be awful, it wouldn't have the same worldwide impact as using a nuclear bomb. China would say, hey, it's not our fault they have a crappy electrical grid and we launched an EMP bomb or whatever the hell they're called, and their whole electrical grid went up in smoke and, 100 million Americans died. Country that spends $1 trillion a year on defense should have fixed their electrical grid. And that's awful, but it wouldn't have the same world impact that a nuclear bomb would. Right away, if they were to try to launch a nuclear weapon, they would lose any support from the international community. But what would everyone say when the Americans get caught with their pants down? Not as much. There would also be some satellite disruption. They have been very active in spy satellites and in satellites to attack satellites and all that. They would probably take out quite a few of our satellites. They might launch attacks on sites.
Gee, there go our cell phones. Wouldn't that suck?
God forbid. I mean, I can't talk to anyone on a cell phone. Meh. But, that would happen. And so that's possible what they're preparing for. But again, when they say they need to practice what it's like to invade a big city and move troops in a modern area, I think they're looking at China. I don't think they're looking at domestic issues here. Because let's face it, short of massive riots and protests, there's no need for the military to do that. And a lot of us kind of like to just stay home. I mean, let's face it, when people are out there protesting and rioting, it's usually never more than half the country, because I don't think anything's going to get the people on the right and the left really riled up. Now, I could be wrong to make them protest together, but there's only a small radical element of our population that would really start rioting and causing problems. But that's just my thought looking forward to the future, that I think they've got China in mind and not some weird domestic situation. That's me. That's my conspiracy theory for the day. We're going to move into our election update briefly. Mitt Romney is up in the polls, and he moved up in the polls after the president's gay marriage announcement, which I found interesting. These polls are starting to hurt Obama. Romney's up with women, who people had said it was initially going to be a problem for him. He's now up in many polls to a point where it's, hitting that 6, 7, 8%, where I consider it to be statistically significant. It's outside the margin of error. I still don't think that legitimately means he's 8% above the president. But when you read these polls that are 3 or 4% with one or the other being above, it's the mood of the person on the telephone that day conducting the survey. But there was a noticeable bump for the president, for Mr. Romney. As for issues coming down the pipeline with Mr. Romney, or Governor Romney, I should say, they were trying last week to bring up this story about him, or 2 weeks ago, bullying a former classmate, trying to make it into a bigger buzz, and I don't think it's going to go anywhere, and for a couple of reasons. I don't know if you read recently, wrote a book on bullying, and he gave a speech, and they said that he really bullied some Christian teenagers and was very rude and mean and nasty to them. And they said, here you are trying to be this big anti-bullying speaker, and you're really just trying to promote your own view of the world. You're bullying people who don't agree with you. Now, I think that had a little bit of impact on it, but is Barack Obama really going to stand up there and try to say, well, don't elect Mitt Romney, he bullies kids? I mean, I know they're trying to paint a picture of him as, your kind of rich jock-type Republican, and they also tried to knock him. They're releasing ads now on some of his Bain Capital work and some of his business credentials. And I know, Ed, you had said this earlier, I don't think that's going to help the president, because you don't really attack a businessman for being good at business.
So he's a successful businessman. You're going to knock that?
And that's the whole thing is people may not agree with all of his tactics, but this is not some Newt Gingrich failed bankrupt company. This is a man who went in with very little and came out with very lot.
And that's a venture capitalist firm. What's a venture capitalist supposed to do? Make money and make successful businesses.
You know, Romney's going to come back and hit back and say, hey, sometimes a business needs to close. Sometimes they're not profitable. And, you know, he's going to help.
He said during the primaries many times, part of his stump speeches and whatnot, was he's been part of some very successful businesses, obviously, as his bank account will show, and he's been part of some colossal failure businesses.
And I think that honesty is going to resonate with people. And I mean, small business owners who make up a significant portion of the economy, they're going to realize, hey, sometimes you got to do stuff in business that you don't like because business is about business. It's about the bottom line. And Mitt Romney's going to tote that line. I think the president is playing it very dangerous. I almost wonder if it's a sign that the president is much more desperate than the media lets on to really find a knock against Mitt Romney. Because I think a lot of middle-of-the-road people are going to say, oh, yeah, maybe Mitt Romney caused some companies to go out of business, but he made a whole hell of a lot of other ones. And I mean, he made money. And I guess the logical question is, well, wait a minute. So what does that mean is going to happen when he's president? Is he somehow going to put a lot of people out of work and make some people rich? I guess the left could try to throw it that way. But the bottom line is if you're already unemployed, you're probably willing to take a chance on Mitt Romney because you don't have a job to lose, as awful as that sounds. Sure, they're going to tote out all these people who I worked for this steel mill and I worked here and then Mitt Romney closed it down. And you know, what I would really like is for Mitt Romney to do some research and come out and say, yeah, we closed this steel mill because it wasn't profitable. And yeah, you know, a couple hundred people lost their jobs. But you know what? We made $4 billion. The government took its cut and, you know, made more in tax revenue from us gutting and selling this place than, you know, it could have by operating for another 10 or 20 years. I mean, the fact that you would keep an unprofitable business open is a foolish idea. But anyway, I don't want to get into that. That's just our election updates. They're going to paint Romney, A, as a social conservative, and B, as a rich, right-wing, bully, factory closer, Uncle Scrooge type of candidate. And I don't know if it's going to work because the other thing is when you look at Romney on stage, yes, he's very well clean cut. And he's a very nice guy. And again, he's not a rich Republican in the mode of Rush Limbaugh. You know, where he likes to, you know, have his big cigars and his 19 wives. And oh, I made a joke about Mormonism there. You know what I mean? His multiple divorces and all that. They're going to look at a guy who's married once to a wife who is suffering with MS and has suffered through breast cancer. And, you know, God bless her for getting through that and still being positive. He's got like 47 children and 112 grandchildren. One of his kids is Tat. I don't know where the hell that came from.
But yet he doesn't smoke or drink.
Exactly. He doesn't smoke. He doesn't drink. He doesn't even drink caffeine. So, I mean, Mitt Romney is, you know, they're not going to be able to paint him as that frat boy as much as they want to. It's going to be very, very tough for them. They do say that Mitt Romney is the Teflon Don, and, you know, it's tough to get stuff to stick to him. So we'll have to see. But I'm going to say there's a 25 to 30% chance that president is more desperate than they're letting on and the media is letting on. And this is just them, you know, sort of grabbing at air. The only other thing in the election update, Ron Paul has dropped out of the election. Moving right on to our full...
You made a bigger stink out of Newt douchebag Gingrich.
Vaughn, I don't want to talk about it. Maybe in the next episode, but I'm still hurting from that. The full disclosure...
Come to think of it, you made a bigger stink out of Herman Cain dropping.
I'm still depressed about that. Although he's pushing his 999 plan around the country, so...
So you really don't want to talk about your convention theory anymore, huh?
I felt that... You're going to make me do it. I felt that Ron Paul would have hacked.
Well, he did say, though, he's looking now for a speech at the convention, and he's got some planks for the platform that he wants to include. So you were right.
I was. I'm just surprised he didn't hold it out a little longer. Just a little longer for Texas and California. Another couple of weeks. And he could have been that, you know, hey, who the hell is this Ron Paul that won that 20 or 30%? Now, the other thing is, somebody from the Romney campaign or the RNC could have been like, look, there's two ways that this can go down. We can give you a speech and we can give you some planks on the platform without you competing in Texas and California, which will make Romney look bad. Or we can, you know, have our hand forced. And he might have said, listen, give me my speech on one of the nights, make me a headliner. And that would actually help the Republican Party. Because they could really use those Ron Paul supporters to come forward for them. And him getting up there and saying, audit the Fed, gold standard, you know, strong currency, get us out of all these wars. That would be a good message for the Republican Party to have one of its nights for the convention. So let's hope that that happens. I would want a speech more than the party platforms, and I want a primetime speech. I don't want a Monday, 3 o'clock in the afternoon speech.
Yeah, right.
The candidate traditionally speaks on Thursday, and the vice president is on Wednesday. And then they sometimes on the Tuesday night will like to put up like a shining star type of person, or, throw up one of the first ladies or presumptive first ladies. I want them to get that.
And that's like the night that Senator Barack Obama spoke.
Exactly, that awful night in 2004. That's when they do. I would like to see Ron Paul in that kind of a situation. And it would be great for the Republican Party to see that. Not not that we're looking to the past with Ron Paul, but not, hey, here's this young upshot that we want to put out there so he can run for president. It's, hey, here's our real core convictions and, the base of our party and whatnot. In an argument that the Republican Party needs to have with itself about its adventurism around the world and about its, lack of fiscal responsibility, because Republicans like to claim that they're fiscally conservative and fiscally responsible, and they just borrow and spend like the drunken sailor Democrats. They're drunken frat boy Republicans. But yeah, so good for Ron Paul, but I'm just disappointed he dropped out or has temporarily suspended his campaign. But that doesn't mean that he won't still be on the ballot in Texas and California and may still not make a significant jump in voter percentage. But we're going to move on to our full disclosure editorial, which, as we say every time, ladies and gentlemen, is just that. It's an editorial of vitriol and virulent opinion and sometimes fact, and it is what it is. So it's the full disclosure editorial, and I'm going to be brief this week on the full disclosure editorial. President Obama came out a few weeks ago to raucous applause from Hollywood and many on the left to support same-sex marriage in this country. Meanwhile, close to 100 young black men have been shot to death this year in Chicago. No different than last year or the year before. Mr. President, where are your priorities? Where are our priorities as a country when we're talking about and giving money and excited about a president supporting same-sex marriage, when young black males are gunned down almost 2 or 3 a week in Chicago, not to mention many other cities? Priorities, America. Priorities. Moving on with that, we're going to go on to the lighter side. I will be moving up to Vermont and commuting every 2 or 3 weeks, or possibly doing some web work for BaseNet TV from up there. But we're going to continue to bring you ViewPoint on our regular schedule every 2 weeks, released on Tuesdays. And I'm hoping to find a very left-wing loony co-host up there, as there are many of them.
You have a good chance of finding one up there.
If I should pray for help from the hippies, or I should pray for the hippies to be helped from me. But either way, on to greener, albeit colder pastures, and expanding the reach of BaseNet TV, as we're going to open up our BaseNet Northern Vermont offices and maybe even branch out into Canada. We're going international.
Canada, eh?
Canada, eh? That is which a very good friend of both Ed and I's named Jim Brink is originally from Canada. So a shout out to him if he is listening.
And we never let him forget it.
This is true. That is all we have for you this episode of ViewPoint. We hope you've enjoyed it. We hope you'll be with us in 2 weeks again when we air. And for BaseNet TV and ViewPoint, this is Tony Mazzucco signing up.